you? Been such a good boy today. Yes, you have. Made new friends at the dog park for the first time now that everything's getting back to normal. Hello, everybody. Just celebrating with Steinbeck, his first day playing at the dog park with other dogs since March 2020. So he did very well. Also, today's video is sponsored by the coldest water. So it occurred to me that I started doing this video series after I was laid off last year, and I realized I had passed my 1-year anniversary for that, which meant I must also have passed the 1-year anniversary of when I started this series, and of course I did, and did not mark it. So we're going to do that now. Today we're going to kick off year 2 of Cameras and Coffee. And when we kicked off year 1, I talked about the future of film photography as it's past. Today we're going to talk about where digital photography can go to improve. So as you listen to this, and I wrote notes, this is the first time I've ever written notes because I wanted to get these right. If you have your own ideas, things that I miss, let me know. By all means, leave a comment. And with any luck, maybe this video will find its way into the hands of corporate marketing executives who will take our sage advice and run with it. So what I did for this video was I put together what we call in the business intelligence and marketing world. Sorry about that. Our resident stunt pilot just buzzed my building. So as some of you know, I've worked in marketing and business intelligence and operational intelligence and things like that. And by that, I don't mean intelligence like intelligence. I mean like researching competitors, competing businesses, and researching how work is done and things like that. And I've done that for about 16 years. So I've gotten pretty good at figuring out how to research subjects. I mean, it stands to reason. I have 2 degrees in English, and we did a lot of research in that. So at any rate, so one of the techniques that we use in business intelligence is called a SWOT analysis, SWOT, and it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So basically what you do with a SWOT analysis is you take a thing and you analyze it based on the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So in my career, let's say, if we were looking at building a building, all right, we want to compete to build this apartment complex, all right. What are our strengths versus the competition? What are our weaknesses? What opportunities do we have to make a better mousetrap for the client? And what threats exist to our success in pursuing this work? So I took that general idea and I put together a SWOT analysis for the future of digital photography. So when I said leave comments, by all means, and also if you can gear them towards a strength, a weakness, an opportunity, or a threat, any combination thereof, one or more, that would be fantastic. I have picked what I felt were the one best of each of those in my list, and I'm going to go into some detail about them. So we'll start with the strength. When we look at the world of digital photography, let's encompass all digital imagery that's available to consumers, okay? So we can break that into 2 very large groups: cell phones, not cell phones. And not cell phones would encompass any kind of digital camera, be it a point and shoot, interchangeable lens, mirrorless and interchangeable lens SLR, interchangeable lens rangefinder, whatever. Anything which is not a cell phone. So that's what we're going to consider. That's what we're going to look at today primarily, is the not cell phone side of the house. And there are some, so one of the main strength, I'm going to argue, for not cell phones, whether it's an interchangeable lens, which camera, there will always be interchangeable lens cameras because professionals are not going to be doing sports photography on an iPhone or an Android phone ever. They're just not good enough. And people who really want to have better image quality will always eventually be drawn to not cell phones. And that is the strength that I'm going to talk about, better image quality. So where does that come from? And it's the bigger sensor, and it's not just the bigger sensor. It's the bigger pixel size. Bigger pixel sizes will improve the way that the individual pixels capture light. They will also reduce the amount of noise because the pixels are larger and less prone to getting error readings. Also, larger pixels will necessitate larger sensors, which means you get the benefits of larger sensors. So it's the same thing if you've ever shot medium or large format and you see how lenses of the same focal length work on those different formats. They just function differently, and they give you a shallower depth of field, the larger the format, bigger image circles, which lots of technical stuff we're going to be going over in much more detail later, not in this video, later in the future months. But because of those larger pixels and the larger sensors and the larger image circles from the lenses and the benefits that that has for lens and image physics, you end up with better image quality that is more editable. There is more data in the images because you're able to capture RAW, which is more editable and which contains more image data. And you are able to get better in-camera results. So those are the three really big things. Let's take them apart. Raw image data is the ultimate for editing your images. If you are a serious photographer, you need to be editing RAW because you get to do a lot more with it. But if you are still at a point where you are only comfortable editing JPEGs, that's fine because it's part of a growth process. So editing JPEGs out of an SLR camera or a point and shoot even, or a non-interchangeable lens digital camera, those JPEGs will be better than comparable era cell phones. If you pick up a brand new digital camera and a brand new cell phone today that both have like a 48 megapixel image sensor, the camera will give you better results. Larger pixels, the lens physics, and the way that the lenses craft the image onto the sensor all combine to do better than the cell phone. Also, lens optics in cameras are made to a higher specification and higher quality standard than cell phone optics, which are pretty much hammered out without quite the attention to detail. So, but wait, what about, let's go back to this whole image circle size. Small formats, like 110 if you've shot film and smaller, everything is in focus, even with like telephoto lenses. And that's true for cell phones. The smaller the sensor, the greater the depth of field, even with wide-angle lenses. But cell phone images, you can get them with a really nice blurry background because of software. Cell phones, to deliver images, rely on software. And we're going to talk a little bit about that with the opportunities section, but I wanted to plant that seed in your mind. When you see images from cell phones that look like they have a really good blurry background or something like that, that was done by an algorithm, not the physics of light passing through the lens reaching the sensor. It's a fundamental difference, and if you know how to see it, it jumps off the image at you. So those are some major strengths, by the way, all of that wrapped into the better image quality. Editing RAW, having better image quality, having the light come through the lens differently, delivering better image quality in camera. Those are all really, really major benefits for the photographer. So what about weaknesses? The major weakness that I'm going to cite, and there are many of them, things like cost, size, system expansion costs, things like that. But the one I'm going to hone in on is that cameras are harder to use than cell phones. Like, simplicity is really hard to engineer. And this is something George Eastman knew in the 1800s when he said, cameras are kind of, I don't know if he said this exactly, but I'm going to assume he said something like this. He said, cameras are kind of hard to use. Let's make them super simple. And what he did was he said, here's a box. You point it at a thing, you pull a string, you push a lever, you do that until you run out of images, and then you send it back to us and we'll take care of the rest. Super simple. And Kodak was, if not the biggest, one of the biggest companies in the world for a very long time because of that. Because what they did was they took a complex thing of set up the camera, put on the lens, take a meter reading, adjust the focus, have the big hood over your head, use a tripod, put in the film back, arm the shutter. They took all of that and they said, we can do that in 2 operations. And now all of a sudden everyone became a photographer or had the ability to take images. The majority of people who take photos don't want to be a professional photographer. 0.1% at most have aspirations of being a professional photographer. Most people want something they can pick up, point it at a thing, click a button, put it back in their pocket and call it a day. And that is what cell phones do. And that's the idea that George Eastman started. That is the brilliance of George Eastman. That is the brilliance of the iPhone and the Android phone. Simplicity is so hard to achieve. So when it's achieved, it's a sign of brilliance. So at any rate, the point of that is cameras are harder to use than cell phones. So serious photographers will always be a minority. Super complex cameras are a major, major barrier to the majority of people adopting cameras instead of cell phones. There's convenience and size built in there as well, but complexity, I'm going to argue, is probably, if not the biggest barrier, then the second biggest barrier. And also more editing is required from images from your cell phone to have them really be their best than is the case with, more editing is required with your camera images than with cell phone images to have them be the best that they can be. And the reason for that is because cell phone makers have pumped tons and tons of money into developing algorithms that do the editing in the camera for you. They do. So we'll get more into this when we get into opportunities next. But cell phones, when you look on the screen of a cell phone and you're seeing the world replay in front of you, what's happening is every frame, 30 frames, 50 frames, however many a second, it's actually a photo being taken by the cell phone, dumped into the RAM buffer, and then cycled through. And that RAM buffer is what, a second and a half long. The image goes in, gets to the end of the buffer, it's deleted. When you take a photo, the cell phone isn't taking a photo at that moment. It's taking the image that was in the buffer when you touched the screen and sliding it into a permanent file. We're going to talk a lot about, well, not a lot. We're going to go over that in the next section, but that is significant because that makes it very easy to use. All you have to do is point the cell phone at a thing and it will take a photo. Let me open up the blinds a little bit here. It's getting a little dark in there. So the genius of the cell phone photography is that the cell phone is doing the majority of the work for the user. Then you also have refinements like the photos being uploaded automatically to the cloud for backup so that there's no SD card to accidentally drop down a sewer grate and lose all your photos, and all that stuff. But if you think about someone who is used to picking up a cell phone, holding it and pointing it at a thing and pushing a button and having it take a photo that's going to turn out reasonably well, picking up a camera with all of its various buttons and menus and customizations, that's really, really daunting. Really daunting. So, and that actually is why this entire channel exists, to help people learn the ins and outs of how their cameras work. And I like to think that it does a good job at that, but at any rate, so the the point of the weakness in cell phone and camera photography rather is the level of complexity that it has versus cell phone photography. So what about opportunities? For opportunities for camera-based digital photography, I'm going to say look at how cell phones work. That's the direction that digital camera photography is being pulled. The reason for that is there are some basic technological improvements that cell phones have over cameras. Now, if you take a look at a mirrorless camera, you're watching the scene through the viewfinder. And when you push the shutter button, it takes the photo and then saves it to memory. And as we talked about in the last section, with cell phones, they're just constantly running images into a buffer and dumping them, and taking the picture actually just moves an image into permanent memory. There's a major difference there in that cell phone images are JPEGs that are compressed, and so they're very small. Maybe a 48 megapixel JPEG from a cell phone, 12 megs, something like that. I think my cell phone's got a 40 meg, I think, sensor on it, and I think I can get 2 photos into an email, which means they're less than 12 megs each. I have a 35 megapixel sensor on my Pentax K1, and it pumps out 45 megabyte RAW files. So that's a huge, it's a 4 to 4.5 fold difference in image size, which means if cameras were going to do the same thing as cell phones, which is just cycle the scene through your buffer and then dump it, the cameras are going to need to have way more RAM than the cell phones have. Cell phones have like 8 gigs, 4 to 8 gigs. I don't know how many gigs of RAM are in a camera, but it would shock me if it was too much more than that. And it would mean that if a camera was going to take JPEG images and do the same thing, it would need like 32 to 64 gigs of RAM to function the same way for a medium-sized camera sensor. That's an expensive component. That's a multi-$100 component. So that's a major cost barrier to being able to do that, because cameras are reading the raw data off of the sensor. But it's a direction that ultimately cameras are going to have to go in, where instead of taking a picture at the moment that the shutter button is pressed, the cameras will have to be able to dump from the buffer into permanent memory as soon as maybe like a finger sensor is pressed. So that brings us to another point, which is that cameras are still, the paradigm is still, the paradigm for cameras is still, it looks relatively like a camera from the 50s. Like, I'm looking at my A7S II right now. And yes, it's digital, and yes, it has a digital viewfinder, but it's got a lens that switches on the front of it. It's got a button for a shutter in the same place as every other similar form factor camera I own and have ever owned has it. Has a lens release in the same place. Has dials in the same place. LCD screens in the same place. Cameras today are not so meaningfully different in terms of interface than cameras of the film era. So that's a major issue. There has not been a paradigm shift in the digital camera world to say, what could a camera be that it isn't? What could a camera be that it isn't? It could be a cell phone. Oh boy, I can hear the unsubscribe buttons now. So what do I mean by that? What I would say, were I in charge of developing the next generation of cameras for a camera maker, first thing I would do is I would pull my team, my software engineering team in together, and I would say, look, we have great software for our cameras, but guess what? There are free open source operating systems for us out there. We're going to switch our cameras to Android. right there. That is how we would do it. And that would allow us to use the Android framework as the operating system for the camera. And it would allow us to make it easier to integrate the camera wirelessly to people's cell phones for purposes of control, data sharing, file backup and uploading, and functions like that. For me, I think that the control is the biggest one. I would love to have a camera for my video manuals that can project in real time to my cell phone, because that would make it so much easier for me to manually focus my lens on the camera when I'm taking those videos. So, but camera makers' apps are lackluster. Even the best of them are lackluster at best. So that would be my first major change. Take the operating system that's in the cameras now, dump it, switch over to an open source like Android, which is the most convenient one to use, quite frankly, and for this, and then start building the functions as Android apps. It's also going to be a whole lot easier than bringing software engineers up to speed on proprietary programming requirements, and it will in the future be significantly easier to find Android programmers, even though there will continue, of course, to be very good Python, PHP, C#, C++, Rust, and so forth programmers who are probably using those are probably some of the languages the cameras use. Off track, sorry about that. So at any rate, that would turning the cameras into being more like cell phones would also allow for a simpler interface. Now, I don't mean having a touch screen on the back of the phone, although those are convenient. I do like buttons and physical dials and things like that, but having an interface which is more streamlined. The sun has come out from behind the cloud, just a sec. But having an interface which is a little bit more streamlined, a little bit easier to use, and less complex will absolutely help convert photographers from being cell phone users to being digital camera users. Steinbeck, I love you too, pup. But my mic is on that side, so just... Steinbeck says, hello, everybody. I know, he's the most popular part of my channel. So, at any rate, the other thing, as I've mentioned, is using buffering like cell phones, and also doing that while keeping the image quality. And that is going to mean significantly more powerful processors, more RAM, just beefier computers. And I think it's a trade-off for that is a good excuse to do away with the super high megapixel counts. Realistically, I think that the megapixel wars for the sensor sizes are going to come to an end sooner rather than later, because there are, frankly, significantly more important metrics in a camera than just how many megapixels the maker is throwing at them. So also there's just a limit to how big files can be before people have had enough. But at any rate, I do see a future where the megapixel count is less important than other metrics such as bit depth or lookup tables, color rendition, raw editability, things like that should be, and I think will be, more important. So if we get to a point where we don't care so much about megapixels and we care more about how well we can work with the images, then we don't need as much on-camera computing power to make them function in a way that is more user-friendly and more cell phone-like. Again, super, super strong things for the camera industry if they're willing to make them happen. So what about threats? All right, there are a lot of threats to the camera industry. Now, like I said, there will always be digital cameras. There will always be a user base that needs them. High-end portrait photographers will need them. Movie makers will need them. Sports photographers especially. Anyone who wants to do really good high-quality work, like wedding photographers, architecture photographers, so on and so forth. Even advanced hobbyists who find cell phones limiting will be there buying cameras. So I will tell you that there will always be a market for digital cameras that are a standalone camera. Will they look like the ones today? Will they be the same number of brands? Will they be the same interface? I would say probably, maybe not, and yes at the same time to all of those questions. That's not a good answer, but it's the one you're getting. So there is a significant threat that I see to the future of digital photography in cameras, and that's what I call ecosystems. Now, ecosystems are a big thing in the cell phone world, or in tech in general. Let's bring people into the Android ecosystem. Let's bring people into Apple or Amazon or Facebook's ecosystem. And what it basically means, the word ecosystem in those senses is used to say, let's get a customer hooked to our product and prevent them from using anyone else's. It's called customer retention in the real world. That in and of itself is not an issue. Customer retention is something all companies do and all successful companies have done. Repeat buyers are necessary for a business to stay afloat. So when I say an ecosystem, the thing I see as being a big threat, this is not an idea for you digital photography executives who are watching this to use. This is a legitimate threat to the future of digital photography. What I see as an ecosystem is a world where camera maker A and photo editing software B get together and they say, let's make it so that our raw files only work on your software, on your editing software. Or let's make it so that our editing software only integrates or primarily integrates with your digital cameras. It sounds like a great thing, like a win-win, like, hey, oh yeah, Mr. Consumer, Mr. and Mrs. Consumer, you're super lucky. You get to buy this one thing and be locked into this other. That's how I would market it if I was told to market it. It's a terrible thing. A lot of people out there have probably started with something like a GIMP or an Affinity Photo, right? And moved up to a Photoshop. Could you imagine if you started with one of those and then in order to move up to a higher end photo editing software, you had to switch to a different camera manufacturer? Like that is a terrible potential future. And it is something that I think is a potential future because, frankly, let's face it, business people are greedy. That would be a really good way to make money. So that idea of locking in the users into multiple different products that all circle around each other and are all linked together would create this little bubble that would be hard to break out of, because leaving that photo editing software or leaving that camera maker means necessarily taking all of these other products that are linked to them and replacing them as well. It would significantly increase the cost of swapping out systems or software. And software is hard to learn. I'm in the process of switching from Vegas Movie Studio to DaVinci Resolve. And it has been very, very, very hard to learn DaVinci. Like, I've wanted to quit a number of times because movie studios, I know, but DaVinci is a completely different mindset. I could not imagine a world in which I would be moving from moving from Movie Studio to DaVinci at the same time as moving from one camera maker to another camera maker, or whatever other products would be linked, one audio editor to a different audio editor. That would be a nearly insurmountable barrier, because during that learning period, I'd have to be paying for both of these things. So I'm going to say right now that having those sort of arrangements, which I really hope never happen, would be exceedingly detrimental to the ability of photographers to grow creatively. It would also be an impairment to to the technology and the hardware companies in the digital photography space to developing creative tools that are usable to the largest potential audience. And it would also stifle creativity and growth within actual innovation and development of camera equipment. So a lot of things to digest there, but I think that realistically the best thing, that I identify that as a threat, and I think the counter to that is to go back to what we were talking about with opportunities. Open source operating systems. Make the things that people use photographically more open, more accessible to people. Take the burden as a manufacturer, as a camera or software or imaging tool manufacturer or programmer on to making it easier for more users to use your product, and then retain them by making the best product on the market instead of trying to lock people in. So I hope that mindset that I fear is out there of trying to lock people into an ecosystem doesn't manifest, because more loyal and better customers come when manufacturers work with them to create a product that they want to use instead of a product system that they're stuck using. So at any rate, welcome to year 2 of Cameras and Coffee, and let's see where this year takes us. I think it's going to be maybe significantly less frequent in terms of video count than year 1, but I do hope that this year there's a chance to do even more in-depth analysis about the camera industry and the new products that are being released, and seeing how they affect the larger picture of the camera industry and you specifically as a photographer. So until next time, I would like to say to Just Me, thank you very much again for all the coffee, the Good Stuff blend, and all credit to my wife here for this. So before we go, I'd like to say to Just Me, thank you very much again for the coffee from What the Buzz down in Texas. I am enjoying the Good Stuff blend, and all credit to my wife for this joke. It is much better than the Bad Stuff blend. I don't know if there's a Bad Stuff blend, but the Good Stuff blend is really good. Thank you again, Just Me, and I will see everybody in the next Cameras and Coffee.